A bizarre phenomenon, the apparent distortion of time. Is time travel possible, or is it all in the mind? Cultibragan training camp at Comrie in Scotland, and in the summer of 1993, home to Army cadet trainer Sue Underhill.
It was the 8th of August, and the day was absolutely frantic. Everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong, and it was 2:30 on the 8th before we managed to get a book out at the guardroom and get out of camp. I drove out of camp. I knew the roads fairly well. I'd actually recce'd the campsite, so I maybe just exceeded the speed limit a little bit because they're not the best of roads, but I was familiar with them. And I'd been out to the cadets on the campsite anyway, so I flew down to Killing, the village where you turn off to go down the tiny road down the other side of Loch Tay. We were already getting very late.
Sue and her colleague David Hardy were heading to the Aberfoyle Visitors Centre, 40 miles away. They had to be there by 3:45. David took over the driving, while Sue nodded off in the passenger seat.
The next thing I remember, which seemed an instant later, but you know what it's like when you've been short of sleep for days. David said, "Sue, where's Oban?" I said, "Oh, it's a fishing town on the west coast. Why?" "Oh, we're 5 miles away from it." And sure enough, he'd stopped and reversed up, and there was a sign. Oban, 5 miles. There's no way we're going to get back in time. Just turn around and head back, you know. It's straight back, you know, we must be on the right road. If we go back the way we've come, we're going to get back to where we started from. So he turned around and we nattered away. And we didn't idle, but we weren't sort of belting along because we knew there was absolutely no hope of getting back. And we came across Loch and Head, and I said, "Oh, go straight by. We'd better go to the visitor centre and, you know, just leave a message. He's going to wonder what on earth happened." And I looked at my watch as we approached the visitor centre turning, and it was only 3:15. We'd left our camp at 2:30. If you know, later when we looked at the map, it's sort of a round trip of about 153 miles.
How had they managed to cover 150 miles in just 3/4 of an hour? Albert Button, a researcher into the effects of electromagnetic fields, may have an answer.
They feel that a short period of time has elapsed and an enormous amount of activity has occurred. This is desynchronization. In actual fact, a normal amount of time has occurred, but their perception of it is distorted.
But why should they even perceive time to be distorted?
I find it very interesting that these two people spent all of their life living on military bases, because the military produced powerful communication systems and radar, which is pulse microwaves, and they would have been exposed to higher levels of electromagnetic pollution than the average person, which would sensitize them to electromagnetic fields in the environment. So this is a key factor in their sensitization.
Only 2 days earlier, Sue and David had come across other evidence of a strong magnetic field.
We saw a lot of lights ahead of us. And as we got near it, there were eyes. And we pulled up, and there must have been, I don't know, I mean, I'd say probably 40 or 50, I might be exaggerating, but there seemed that density of cats, all different sort of sizes. Some seemed quite large, and they were sitting around totally ignoring us, but they were right across the road, they were in a circle, just before the turning to the junction. And I mean, we couldn't go. They were there sort of 2 or 3 minutes, and then they also got up and strolled off their different ways. It seemed absolutely weird to me, but apparently I've heard since that there was probably a magnetic field there, and they love it, and they'd all be attracted to it, again, sit there and do whatever cats do.
Yes, Susan Underhill and David Hardy produced a report on some unusual experiences that they had when they went driving through parts of Scotland. Looking at the areas that they covered, I can see that most of the area is on the Highland Boundary Fault. I talked about geological faults and the energies that these can produce at the surface. They were actually in a highly faulted area that is riven by dip and strike faults, producing piezoelectric, piezo-magnetic fields at the surface. Driving through these produce all kinds of anomalous effects.
Could these geological faults produce fields that disrupt perception of time? Sue and David thought little more of it until one evening at the same camp 2 years later.
At 9:30, went and checked on the guard, booked out and drove out of camp. And we headed off for Callander, where there's a Chinese restaurant. And we spent a good hour over a meal, I would think. I knew we'd left camp at 9:30 because of booking out. And we hadn't hurried to Callander. But I know as we left the restaurant, it was 11:45. And we set off, walked to the car, drove out to Callander. And it was one of those magical clear nights that you really only get in Scotland. And the moon shining down on Loch Leonard was spectacular. I drew David's attention to it. Of course, when you're driving, you can't really appreciate these things quite as well. And I was still, I think, admiring the moon's reflection when David went into complete panic. Jammed the brakes on, skidded the car to a halt. And there in front of us was our famous sign that we'd seen 2 years before. Oban, 5 miles.
Somehow, they had arrived at the same sign over 70 miles away. But this time, as they drove back, they seemed to be on a different road they had never seen before.
It was really quite spooky. And we seemed to drive forever and ever and ever. And eventually we came to a little village and a railway bridge. And it was quite a long railway bridge. You went round a corner actually under the bridge. It was quite a width of bridge. I'd never seen it before.
The only railway bridge over that road had been demolished in 1965. As they came out from under the bridge, Sue recognized where they were.
And as we came out to the other side, I realised we were actually at Loch Leonard. And David had gone past it. We had to reverse up because the turning wasn't like it should have been. It wasn't a big turning with your white lines in the middle of the road for sort of right turn and keep left signs and things. It was only a little turning with no white lines at all. And it was an old-fashioned sign. We thought it was probably a different road. I said, look, let's go somewhere we know. Let's turn down it. So we turned down and drove along, and we were beside the loch. The Loch Earn was on our right-hand side, so it had to be the right road. But there was sort of white painted fence down the road beside us, between us and the loch.
The road hadn't looked like that for at least 30 years.
There was still no sign of cars anywhere, no cars parked outside the houses or anything. It was quite really weird. And it wasn't until we got back to Comrie and to the fish farm, just as you turn into Comrie, that the streetlights were there and everything was, lo and behold, everything was just normal.
Areas that they drove through seem strange and unreal. This is another effect that is also very well documented in the neurological literature called jamais vu, which is the opposite of déjà vu. Déjà vu is where something happens to you and you feel that it's quite familiar. Jamais vu is the reverse, where you feel that things are strange.
Were Sue and David somehow seeing images of the past? Driving 70 miles back from Oban, they expected to get to camp in the early hours of the morning. But when they arrived, they found the gates still unlocked.
And we drove back into camp, and David was really annoyed because the camp gates were still unlocked. And it is a rule that they lock the gates up at night. David let the window down and to book back in, because the guard came up. You have to book in as well as out of camp. And the RSM came out of the guard room and said, "It's not time to lock the gates yet." And we told him what had happened. And he just couldn't believe it, because of course he remembered on Sunday the 8th of August 2 years before, we'd got lost, we thought, and ended up just outside Oban. And here we were, outside Oban again. It was as if you'd gone through into a different time zone and popped back out again.
Sue and David had again covered the distance in an impossible time. Had they also travelled back 30 years? Or is it all the work of electromagnetic fields and jamais vu?
I didn't really realise that we had lost time. It was just incredible, because we seemed to have been walking backwards in time. Obviously, now it's amazing that knowing how or what the distance we must have travelled, but at the time it seemed perfectly acceptable.